Erev Tov, everyone. Good evening. I think it's time to get started tonight. Just one moment. I want to welcome everyone to our Zoom conversation with Chancellor Arnold Eisen, our good friend who is in the last couple weeks of his time as Chancellor at JTS, and he's going to be coming live to us from his apartment in New York. It's really wonderful to have this opportunity to chat with Chancellor Eisen before he finishes his time, though we hope that there'll be many more opportunities after that as he becomes Chancellor Emeritus, I guess, unless you've chosen a different title after he finishes. This conversation's a long time coming, and it has evolved. We talked over maybe a year ago at this point about Chancellor Eisen and his wife Ace coming in and doing a joint Scone residence weekend in April for us, which we're very much looking forward to. And in that conversation, we were going to talk about, kind of reflect on his time as Chancellor and think about the conservative movement and what's happened from when he started in 2007 till today. And then, of course, COVID-19 came and disrupted life for everybody, and this program as well. So we reached out and we talked and we said, all right, we can do a session over Zoom together. We can talk about COVID-19 and how the world has changed after that. Great, sounds good. Let's put that together. And then, of course, after Memorial Day weekend, we had the murder of George Floyd, and we had all the racial violence and the protests and the tension that has come up that we've been addressing as a community and we've seen around the country. And we have something new to talk about as well. So we are going to have a wide-ranging conversation this evening, thinking about all those issues and others as well. The way it's going to work is I'm going to start in conversation with Chancellor Eisen, asking him a few questions and to get the conversation going. If you would like to ask a question of Chancellor Eisen, you're encouraged to please write one in the chat. It should come to me or to Alex Weinberg. We might not be able to answer, we probably won't be able to ask all the questions that are put in the chat, so our apologies in advance if we do not get a chance to answer your question. But if you do have questions for Chancellor Eisen, please send them up in the chat and we will take a look at them. So of course, Arnold Eisen is the 7th Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and in his time there, the seminary has gone under some pretty incredible changes, and I feel like I'm kind of uniquely positioned to say that because Chancellor Eisen's first year, while he was still doing this from California, was my last year at JTS in Rabbinical School, and his time has been the same as my time at TBS. And really, JTS has been transformed during that time, most recently physically, as it's recently opened its 21st Century Campus that we were scheduled to go and tour in March. That hopefully will come back, and we'll get to do that, God willing, very soon. Have a chance to see it and see what's happening there. He's also placed a strong emphasis on Jewish learning in communities, and provided all sorts of other wonderful things at JTS, which are important and wonderful. I don't mean to give them short shrift, but I'll say from our perspective, we're very grateful that I think we are talking today that this is your 7th visit with us, Chancellor Eisen. It's your time as Chancellor, which we really feel blessed to have had so many opportunities to talk with you over the years and to learn from you. You came for the opening of Kelman Brown Academy and its new building to help open that, and we had a conversation at TBS after that. You helped kick off our Dr. Jeffrey Kramer Bioethics Initiative at TBS. You're our very first speaker in that initiative as well to help frame that conversation, which of course has gone pretty incredible places. I was very honored that you were the speaker at my installation as senior rabbi in 2014. That meant a lot to me and to our community to have you there as well. You helped guide our strategic planning committee in 2014 too. And we really appreciate and value that relationship. And it's something that we're able to celebrate as we're in the process of setting up a TBS JTS scholarship fund at JTS to help provide scholarships for TBS students who've attended the seminary. And we know that we're very fortunate to have many students that have been in Liss College, in the graduate school, the rabbinical school, the cantorial school, the education school at JTS, and we benefited from that too. Now, there's something else that's a great contribution of Chancellor Eisen during this time that was reminded to me by our friend Yael Asbel, a member of our shul, of course, a member of the Board of Trustees, who thinks your greatest contribution is that in your time as Chancellor, both the Phillies and the Eagles won world championships. So for that, we are grateful as
You're
well.
welcome.
We'll give you credit for all of it.
Thank you.
So it's a pleasure to have you here tonight for our seventh conversation. Your last as Chancellor, but certainly you're not the last one that you'll have at TBS with all of us. So first of all, I want to welcome Chancellor Eisen to our virtual synagogue. And before we really get into it, how are you doing? How are you and your family right now? How's everybody holding up?
Everybody's fine, Micah. It's a really interesting time. It's a great time for me personally. It's such a hard time for the world and for all of us because we're all affected directly and indirectly by the virus and now by the protests against racial injustice. But for me personally, it's a wonderful time. I think we all would like to have the chance to step down from a job we love at a time when we choose, not because we're tired of the job, but because there are other things that we want to do and because we think it's time for someone else to take a shot at bringing new ideas to the job, as I did 14 years ago. So it's a wonderful time, and the goodness is completed by having a successor that I'm so proud of and overjoyed to have as my successor, because I have personally known people that have left jobs and been replaced by people that they weren't happy with. And in my case, it's exactly the opposite. I could not possibly be happier than I am with Provost Schwartz, who's going to succeed me. So it's a great time for me, Micah. Thanks for asking.
Well, I'm glad you're doing well, and I'll say too, we're very happy to hear that Dr. Rubin Schwartz, the current provost of JTS, is going to be becoming its 8th chancellor, its first female chancellor, and of course, Dr. Rubin Schwartz, Shuli, is someone who is also a good friend for many of us and a good friend of TBS, and has spent many Shabbatot with us as well. When Rabbi Moshe and Aviva Schwartz were with us for a number of years too in the community, so we're very excited for that to continue on as well. Very good news for the Jewish people, I think. So let's start there and kind of pick up what you're reflecting on. As you start to look back on your 14 years of chancellor, first, how does it? What would you say are some of the real accomplishments that JTS and the conservative movement has made in your time, and what do you think are some of the main challenges that it faces looking ahead?
You used the word change when you introduced me, and it struck me when I first took the job that the rate of change was so fast, and the JTS had to move a lot faster to keep up with that change. So we instituted a lot of changes, particularly to the professional schools. We believed that JTS had to change its focus a bit. We were a wonderful school of Jewish studies, and we were preparing rabbis and cantors and educators and lay leaders with the greatest Jewish studies background that anyone could possibly receive anywhere. But I think we needed to put more emphasis on the professional training, the mentoring, the nurturing, the formation of clergy and educators and lay leaders to take the jobs they had to take in this changing society. So we had to teach people how to perform this art of change by way of tradition and tradition by way of change. And that is one of the major hallmarks of my administration. So people on the outside will see the new buildings and they'll, I think, see a change in the professionalization of the management, and the finances are stronger. But on the inside, what you're going to see at JTS is a whole new set of curricula and an emphasis on preparing leaders for the job of leadership in a changing world. And I think one sees the impact on the conservative movement as well, that we all recognize that we can't operate with 1930s or even 1950s synagogues and schools in the second and third decade of the 21st century, because the world is totally different. And we knew this even before COVID completely overturned our lives. So we already were facing IT, and by the end of my term, AI, and genome editing, and new competition from China, and dynamic changes in the Middle East. And everywhere you look, political changes, economic changes, social changes. And so the Jewish community cannot remain static with all these changes. And I think we're beginning to see below the surface and on the surface changes in the conservative movement as well which are going to make it stronger. And you know about the increased cooperation among our institutions, which is a very good sign. You know about the strength of Camp Ramah and the increasing cooperation between USY and Camp Ramah. So we could go on about this, but I'm really confident this is a very good time, both the JTS and the conservative movement. We kind of woken up and recognized that the pace of change is so fast, we've got to keep moving to keep up. And I think that's what we're about to do now.
Yeah, and I think that really resonates. I mean, things are changing so quickly. And I've commented to a few people, and I know I'm not the only rabbi or cantor to say this, that I feel like in the last 3 months, I've used skills that I didn't know I had, and I've had to learn new things, like all Jewish educators had in so many ways, to try to navigate this new reality and this technology to connect with people in ways I haven't even understood before. So how do you educate somebody to be nimble in a time of change? Because it does seem to be the only constant right now.
It does. And so there are several different levels in which it works. So for example, we kind of had a head start on the Zoom operations that we had to launch in March, because we already recognized that a lot of our education of the community had to take place through distance learning. So we had distance learning degrees, both in our Davidson School and in our graduate school. But more importantly, we launched a huge community engagement project, which reached many thousands of people all throughout North America and beyond, with webinars and podcasts and all sorts of live stream programs that didn't exist before, but we recognized already about 7 or 8 years ago that this had to be a major feature of JTS. So on the one hand, you try to imbue students with the confidence that they will have the tools to meet whatever challenges come their way. You can't have Jewish leaders who are afraid of change. And this is a kind of a mindset. You can't have people be leaders who are cowering in the corner and not rushing out to embrace the changes that are coming their way. And the way you teach them this confidence is by giving them acquaintance with some of the new techniques that I was just talking about, but also grounding them firmly in the tradition and showing them that for the last 3,000 years or so, Jews have repeatedly all the time been faced with incredible upheavals. And we've responded with this art of balancing continuity with innovation. And you show students all these examples of previous revolutions in Jewish life that we have successfully managed without losing the heart of who we are, without stopping to be the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition that we are. And yet we changed dramatically. And most recently, post-war Judaism in America and of course in Israel are both radically different than anything we had before. In a sovereign Jewish state, of course Judaism has changed radically, but that's no less true in America and in Canada, which are unlike any other diaspora Jews have had before. So if you give students this confidence that they have the learning that it takes, they have the skills inside themselves, whether they're going to be cantors or rabbis or educators or lay leaders or scholars, they can do it. And it's a message that our Jewish community needs to hear right now, because I run into a lot of people who are frankly scared. They're worried that the virus and the upheavals it has caused are going to take something precious away from us that we're never going to recover, or that if we don't freeze in place right now, we're going to lose it. And we can't freeze in place. To freeze in place right now is to die. That's obvious. So the art, as always, is to pick out what's essential, what do we have to carry forward, and what can we afford to change? What must we change? And as I keep using the word art, there's no science here. It's pure art. But fortunately, we have a long tradition and a lot of history to guide our way.
Right. Great. So let's pick up on one of those major disruptions in COVID-19. And as we do that, I just want to remind everyone that if you have a question for Chancellor Eisen, you're welcome to write it in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to all the questions. But please feel free to write that question in the chat, and we will take a look at it. So COVID-19, right? It's caused a real disruption to our world and with any community, and certainly within the Jewish community. We're doing all sorts of things differently than we would have had before. We're doing, like many congregations, we started Zoom Minyanim. We're doing Zoom Shabbat services. We've had four Zoom B'nai Mitzvah, so far as well that we're working on. And it's really, I think made us think about what it means to be part of a community, and also how we engage people and how we can reach people. So in reflecting just a few months into this, and there's still much to learn from this, from your perspective, what do you think we've learned so far about community, about the Jewish community, the conservative Jewish community? And how do you think that's going to change what we do in building community going forward after this?
Yeah, so you know, because you've heard me speak more than once, that I believe the secret of Jewish survival and thriving is that we offer Jews what I call capital M meaning and capital C community that's not available to them easily anywhere else. And both of these things have been threatened by the COVID virus. So you put your finger on the community, and I'll talk about that in a second. But let's own up to the fact that this is also a challenge to capital M meaning. So much death, so much suffering. And on the one hand, it appears random. So like anyone who suffers, who asks the question, why me? Why my family? Why not someone else? Did I do something wrong? Am I being punished? Why is this happening to me? But then we were struck by the fact that it's not random, that there are inequities, there are injustices, that not all communities are suffering the same way. And so that also causes crises of meaning. But I've heard many people say to me, well, if God can send plagues, can't God cure plagues? Did God send this plague, et cetera, et cetera? And so you're challenged to answer questions of meaning that are always there, and rabbis and others are used to dealing with them at moments of challenge in life, specifically death and illness. But now they're confronting all of us in a big way. So there are challenges to capital M meaning. The challenge to community has been manifold, but the first thing it's done is remind all of us about how important community is. We're just not willing to give up on it. We could have just said, okay, can't go to synagogue, forget it, no more services. Or can't go to funerals, can't go to shivas, all right, we just won't. But it turns out that these are precious goods. These are capital G goods. This is capital C community here. And so we're doing the best we can. Partly we're running on fuel from before. That is, we're using our memories of what it was like to be physically present with people around tables, sharing meals, and in rooms together. And with those memories, we're getting through this extended period of not seeing each other face to face up close, but seeing each other on camera. I don't know how long that can last. I think it can last a little while longer yet, but we can already see in the attitudes that many Americans are taking this pent-up demand to be with people again, to actually be physically close to people, because that's a precious part of our humanity. We've also seen, paradoxically, that on the one hand, our neighbors are now threatening in a way they weren't before. I don't know how it is, in Cherry Hill, but I walk down the street on the Upper West Side. I did it today, and it's amazing. People come close to you, and they're not wearing masks, and you have to move away. You walk out into the street to avoid these people. So the lesson is clear that every person is a potential source of danger. So we want to love our neighbors as ourselves, but it's precisely our neighbors who, by their carelessness or whatever decision they've made not to wear masks, are threatening us or making life more dangerous for us. On the other hand, there are neighbors you never noticed before who you now are so grateful for you couldn't do enough for them. The people who deliver food and deliver mail and drive the subways and keep them going and are cleaning the streets, and the EMTs who are manning these ambulances that we hear nonstop in New York, and the hospital workers, etc. So there are all sorts of neighbors that you feel more connected to. And I would say, Micah, that we always knew that community was not just local, it was global. We always had this phrase, global community. But after this virus, you can't doubt they're a part of a global community, because you know the same dangers and the same strategies are being employed everywhere around the world. And there are scientists in labs everywhere in the world who are sharing information, not hoarding it, but they're sharing information freely. The minute they get a finding, they're sharing it, because our lives, the return to normal depends on them. So we are much more aware of community in all these ways than we were before. And I think, without being a prophet, without prognosticating, what we're likely to do is we're going to find a way to save as much of physical face-to-face community as we possibly can, because it's precious. But we're going to supplement it with distance learning and distance community wherever we have to be as inclusive as we now are. And let me just say one more thing about community, because it's really come home to me that this community of ours is an interfaith community. And this has always been important to me as a Jewish person. When I became chancellor, I was proud that JTS has a tradition of interfaith cooperation and dialogue that goes way back. But you see now the way that faith leaders from all different traditions are cooperating to offer hope and comfort at this time, because it's absolutely necessary. It means so much to people. It means so much to people that we're not facing this alone. And so that lesson also has been reinforced, that to be part of a Jewish community does not prevent participation in larger communities. And that's a precious boon of America. That's part of being not only a Jew, but a Jewish human being, an American Jew, this degree of unparalleled pluralism and cooperation we have with other faith communities. So it's a mixed bag, Micah, but on the whole, I think we've learned a tremendous amount, and I think we're going to take those lessons with us.
So I want to go back to the meaning piece, and it's something that you've spoken about at TBS2, meaning and community with capital letters. It's something I think about often. And I saw one poll in which you can, surveys, you can trust them or see what they are, but it was about religious faith during COVID-19. I don't know if you saw this one, that was something like 25% of Christians say their faith has been strengthened during COVID-19 as it was breaking out. But for Jews, it was about 4% or something very low. What do you think what do you think Jewish theology has to say about this? And why is it that Jews, seemingly not just from here, but I'll say, from my experience in CPE in a hospital, being a hospital chaplain while at JTS too, Jews seem to have a hard time thinking about the meaning piece, especially when it becomes to God, as these types of things happen.
So, I was the co-author of a book called The Jew Within that came out in 1970, and the research was done by 1997. And there too, we asked Jews, do you find your faith in God strengthened when someone close to you passes away or is very, very ill? And the answer across the board was no, but I find my connection to the Jewish community strengthened. And I think you would find that that's true today too. Judaism is a very special religion in that the religion itself proclaims that it does not have answers to a lot of the most difficult, profound questions that Jews will ask. To me, when Deuteronomy in chapter 29 declares that the mysteries belong to the Lord our God, but the revealed things belong to us and our children to do these mitzvot, that's one of the most profound truths I know. Read any great Jewish thinker. I was just teaching Maimonides to someone this week. Maimonides is the first to admit that he does not know the answers to all these difficult issues. So what Judaism provides is not so much one answer, but a whole set of answers from which we can choose. But more importantly, it provides a way. Torah is a way of living a good and meaningful life in the absence of the answers to these questions. So why is it that there's suffering in the world? Why is it that there's so much evil in the world? Why is there injustice in the world? Is not God in the world? Is not God a good God? And so what we do is we go on, we do mitzvot, we participate in this covenant, which gives us the responsibility for joining with God to make the world better, to make the world more just and compassionate. And we do all this in the absence of those answers. So do Jews feel closer to God at a time of pandemic? Well, would Judaism expect them to feel closer to God? Because if you think that God is setting the pandemic and that you should focus all your energy on trying to figure out why God wants to kill millions of people in the world through this pandemic, I suppose you might come closer to God in argument or in protest. But we've got a Bible that has the book of Job in it. And what does this book of Job teach us except that we're not going to answer questions like this? And so the meaning to Jews does not come in answering the questions. The meaning to Jews comes in the Jewish life, this rich and powerful way of life that's grounded in community that enables us to go on in the absence of final answers. And that's as good as I can do in reference to these questions, except to say no. So we had it forcefully during Passover, right? We were a month into the pandemic and we had Passover. And I'm sure your Seder, as in mine, you read the 10 plagues, and you say, is this the 11th plague? So did God send this plague? Did God send those other 10 plagues? Is that what the text is telling us? So God was okay with all those Egyptians suffering and dying? What are you going to do with this? And so this is a tradition, unlike most others, that welcomes such questions. It rejoices in such discussions. It urges us, instead of discouraging doubts and questions like this, it encourages us. And then why would anybody want to participate in a tradition that does this? Because Judaism is such a wonderful way to be a human being. And you experience that, and I think many of us, even in this virus, or Dafka in this period of the virus, stuck at home here, doing Zoom calls, we've experienced the wonders of this tradition. And so like you, I've done a bris on Zoom, and more than one Shiva on Zoom, and a funeral on Zoom. And is it what we want it to be? No. But is it meaningful? Is it a source of richness in your life? Does it make it possible for you to participate in things from far away that you had never been able to participate in before? Are people able to say Kaddish now with a minyan, thanks to Zoom, that never could have said Kaddish before? Yes, we're doing incredible things right now. And I think that's profound.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think everyone on this call can think of some examples that, as much as we prefer to be together in person, where Zoom's really been a blessing and has brought people together and more people together from further apart in a way that we could ever anticipate. I want to pivot now to the questions on racial injustice. And as I do that, I just want to remind everyone who's on that if you have questions for Chancellor Eisen, to please write them in the chat to me or to Alex, and we'll get to those questions very shortly. And you're welcome to write those questions in, and we'll take a look at them. But we know that we're confronting racial injustice, and whereas a synagogue, we're trying to do our part to support Black Lives Matter and to do in this fight. Now, I know that Abraham Joshua Heschel is one of your heroes. And of course, his model is one who is a leader in the civil rights movement and who taught and practiced what he taught in terms of for racial justice. Is someone who we really look to and think about. And in the Lunch and Learn that I'm going to start teaching tomorrow, we'll be teaching in the next few weeks. We're going to be looking at Heschel and activism and the roots of some of his activism. But I'm curious, what do you think Heschel has to teach us right now for this moment? And connected with that, what do you see as our responsibility as conservative Jews, as a synagogue community, towards fighting racial injustice today?
The essay where Heschel lays all this out most clearly is an essay called Religion and Race from early 1963. And that essay has a significance beyond the points that Heschel made in it, because it was a speech he gave in Chicago at a conference, which is where he met Martin Luther King. And what they both realized, that they were both following God's commands as laid down by the prophets. And this essay is where Heschel most clearly, in a short essay, lays out his thoughts about prophecy as well as his thoughts about injustice. So for Heschel, it goes like this, that the dialogue between God and Pharaoh is still going on. He says this in paragraph 1. Moses, representing God, says, "Let my people go, that they may worship me." And Pharaoh says, "Who is this God that I should care about whether you worship him or not?" And this, Heschel said, is still the argument. If one takes the notion that there's a God who cares about justice, as we do, then this God cannot tolerate the fact that some people are oppressed because of the color of their skin. For Heschel, it was that straightforward. And the battle that the book of Exodus describes is still going on, and it's our battle, and we have to join it. I put it in these stark ways because that's what Heschel did. The prophets are stating a demand. Some of God's children are not allowed to persecute others of God's children because their skin is of a different color, period. Now, Heschel argued as well, and this is Judaism. This is to me the basic center DNA of Jewish life, that we're in covenant. For whatever reasons, and we'll never understand them, God wants partners. We are God's partners in fulfilling the mandate that the world should be as God intended, which is a world that's more just and compassionate than it is. Either God can't or God has chosen not to do the actions that we are needed to perform. For Heschel, this was basic stuff. We are needed to add justice and compassion to the world. And that's the demand he heard from the prophets. And he confesses that at first he couldn't take it seriously because it presumes that God actually cares about the world. And there's so much evidence to the contrary. Just remember that Heschel's entire family practically is wiped out by the Nazis. So God cares about a world in which the Nazis can wipe out 6 million Jews. Well, Heschel's convinced that yes, despite that evidence to the contrary, God does care about this world, and God needs us to help God exercise care for the world. So then you come to the specific case, and one has to admit that this is not the 1960s. We're 2 generations later. And in some respects, it's a much better place because the kind of naked segregation that you can't go into a hotel, or you can't sit at a lunch counter, you can't enjoy accommodations, you can't do those things. Okay, at least legally we took care of that, even though enforcement is not universal. And we all know the Voting Rights Acts of the 1960s are being chipped away and not being enforced as much as they should be. But there are other problems. The poverty is worse. The disparities in income are worse. The joblessness is worse. And the fact, I repeat this every time because it's the single most shocking fact of this that I know, because I'm a college professor and I'm the head of an institution of higher education. A 17-year-old black man has a better chance of going to prison than of going to college. A black teenager has a better chance of going to prison than of going to college if they're male. It's unacceptable. It's just unacceptable. And we all know that there are all sorts of things that we think should be changed, and we can't change everything all at once. But I think there is some general recognition that this particular set of changes, these surviving racial injustices and inequities, have to be moved up to the top of the order of priorities because A, it's indisputable that black men are being shot by police, and number 2, that black people are dying at a disproportionate rate from COVID for all sorts of reasons, not just discrimination, but a complex socioeconomic pattern that results in malnutrition, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a collective realization in many quarters of society, including the Jewish quarter of society, that we can't just sit back and let gradual reform take its course. You've got to do something about this. And I'm not an expert on these matters, and I don't know exactly what an individual synagogue is going to do. I can tell you that JTS is going to launch a whole series of dialogues, starting with our own employees, to talk to them about what they think JTS should do. We've never really asked the employees of color before what they want their institution to do about these sorts of things. And now we're going to ask. And we have a new Center for Ethics and Justice at JTS. And the attention of that center is going to be turned in a big way toward racial injustices, which are at the top of the list now of anti-ethics that we see. And so all of us are going to have to take stock and figure out what it is we're going to do. But to me, I'll end with this, Micah, as I began with it. If you have a tradition that has an entire middle section of its primary text, its holy scriptures, this middle section is called Nevi'im. And this huge section of text, which is formative for us, is about the battle between kings who are just being kings the way the kings are kings and going on with business as usual and power games and war and injustice, and the prophets who are saying, God wants something better. And we put that at the very center of our Holy Scripture. And the Talmud, as we know, is not overwhelmingly concerned with what God is like. We don't know. The Talmud is overwhelmingly concerned with how we're going to live in the world. And so this is who we are. Are we simply going to close our wagons into a circle and try to hide from this? Or are we going to open ourselves wide and engage the problem? And it seems to me that Jews are here to do the second.
Great. Well, thank you. And then there's, I think there's some more questions that we'll get to on that. I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have been asked in the chat. And if you have other questions, you're welcome to put them into the chat. So let's start with this one from Eric and Sue Balin to build off of what you were just talking about. If you could speak more about what Jews can do to heal the rift with the African American community that feels like it has gone downhill since the late 1960s. Specifically, you spoke about JTS and talking to its employees of color, which seems like an important step. Are there other things that you see that the Jewish community can do, or communities like ours can do, to help heal the perceived rift?
I think that, look, some of this work is political, and I'm still going to be Chancellor of JTS for 2 more weeks, thank goodness. And so I'm not going to enter into political argument, left versus right, Democrat versus Republican, but let's just say in a general sense that a greater proportion of the resources of our society, which are huge, have got to go to the poorest members of our society. I think it was Mario Cuomo, father of Andrew, who talked beautifully at that Democratic convention about a society being judged by the fact that it doesn't leave its weakest members behind, right? And we have in our tradition all these commandments about taking care of the stranger and the fatherless and the widow, the most weak members of society. So our values dictate that we're going to have to advocate for caring more for the members of our society that need care. The second thing is that people look to us. This is a lesson that I did learn as Chancellor of JTS, that when I was invited to speak at a rally that took JTS faculty and students on a march through Harlem, it meant a lot to the residents of Harlem that we were joining with them and speaking to them and listening to them. And then when I was invited as the only white person, let alone the only Jew, to an event marking the 50th anniversary of King's assassination, and I saw the way that I was received because of Heschel and because of the prophets, and I would say because of this shared tradition, a shared narrative of liberation. So we're not just anybody, we're Jews. And there's a special bond here, even if it's frayed, between Africans, Americans, and Jews, which means they look to us in particular to speak out on these issues and to stand with them. And just to stand with them. So I don't know what the synagogue is doing in this regards, and I don't give other people advice, but I've learned from my own experience just to physically stand with people. And now we're going to have to do it with masks on our faces, but just to stand beside people, right? So I haven't been out in the protests this week because of the virus, right? But when we can do that again, just inviting people into our homes and being invited into their homes and listening, this is going to make a major difference, because there's a lot of people who feel like they're just not listened to, and that's our first task. But I wish I had more answers. We will, as a community, be developing answers. I'm sure that if we were to meet a year from now, the Chancellor of JTS and the Rabbi of TBS would both have more answers to give.
Okay. So ask Shuli, is what you're saying. Just kidding.
And Shuli will ask you.
That's right. Good. All right. A few other questions on a couple of different topics. Here's one that you're welcome to go into if you'd like to or not. It's about technology on Shabbat, right? The use of technology on Shabbat has changed quite a bit during COVID-19. And Mike Perlow is interested in how technology might be continued used after Shabbat. And I'll mention I'm a member of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. This is something that was permitted during this time of COVID to create a virtual minyan to be able to gather together on Shabbat in a way that we wouldn't normally have thought, or I should say most conservative rabbis, I think, wouldn't have done before this pandemic. And I admit, in the conversations in the committee, and I'll myself wonder, once these things start happening, the horse is out of the barn, if you will, and what does it mean? And is it something that, as we spoke about earlier, can further our goals with the large C community and also with meaning? But also, what does it take away when it comes to traditional Shabbat observance, especially at a time when technology is so overwhelming for us? And I know for me, I really missed that 25-hour break from looking at my computer, even though it's for just a few hours on Shabbos morning. I missed that quite a bit, being able to really unplug, if not for emergencies, over the course of Shabbat. So curious about any of your thoughts about that technology, Shabbat, now and later.
So as your question indicates, one considers this on two different levels. And the first is the level of halakha. And you are a member of the law committee, and I am not, and not a rabbi, and not a Talmudist. And so I follow halakha according to the law committee of the Rabbinical Assembly. But Mike, if I can answer your question, I'm going to come at it from a distance, as it were, and you'll see that I'm going to come back to it, because the second level in which I consider this is a kind of personal level of meaning and comfort level. I once had a Muslim cleric and legal authority in my living room, along with a conservative rabbi. And the Muslim and the rabbi both agreed that legally it was permitted to do trick-or-treating on Halloween. The Muslim legal authority had actually written a fatwa allowing Muslims in America to let their kids trick-or-treat, even though in many ways it's a pagan holiday. And the rabbi thought that was halachically okay. And they agreed that neither of them was going to let their kids trick-or-treat anyway. I felt perfectly comfortable and happy having a Passover Seder on Zoom. I did not want to have a Seder with just my wife and me. It would have completely destroyed the holiday not to have our families and our friends. We normally have very large Seders with very long and wonderful discussions. So we did Zoom on Passover. And I said Kaddish for my mom, her Yortzeit is Shavuot. And without much compunction, I went to Shavuot services at my conservative synagogue on Sheikh Chesed on Zoom and said Kaddish for my mom. But I can't bring myself, for the reason you mentioned, to use Zoom for a service on Shabbat, for precisely that reason you mentioned. We're enslaved to these machines now. It's more oppressive than it ever was before. And I don't want to come to Shabbat services on Zoom, even though I would like to hear the Torah read from the scroll. But I've long since found davening by myself early Shabbat morning to be very meaningful. I didn't start doing it when the virus began. I used to do it and then go to shul afterwards. And so now I get up and sit in my chair by the window and daven alone and find that meaningful. And my wife and I, every Shabbat, have a long Torah discussion. And I find that to be much more meaningful and satisfying than turning on one of these screens again on Shabbat. So I'm going to try to hold out. But what I'm really afraid of is we're going to get to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and not be able to meet in person. That is, to me, terrifying. It's apparently a decision that's upon us pretty soon. And I don't think I'm going to be willing to miss out on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. If I don't hear those melodies on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, my whole year is going to be a distraught year. My whole year is going to be impoverished. And so I think I'm probably going to have to bend on the holidays, but I'm going to try to hold out for a while longer on Shabbat, while doing all I can on Kabbalat Shabbat before sunset and doing Havdalah on Zoom after Shabbat ends, et cetera, and doing all we can for Jewish enrichment during the week. That's as honest an answer as I can give. And I think we're all in this boat that what is now halachically permissive may not be exactly what we feel comfortable with.
Yeah, I think you are at least for me, articulated exactly. And it's a hard thing. It's beautiful on the one hand for people to be able to get together, even though it can't be physically. And on the other hand, it feels like it changes Shabbat in a fundamental way. That also for myself, I find challenging. You on this topic, Rabbi Lindemann just sent in a question. The first one he asked, you answered already, which is about where do you expect to be on Rosh Hashanah. But he also asks, where do you expect JTS students to be, at school or online?
This decision is, I think we've given ourselves to July 1st to make it. You notice that every institution of higher education is delaying as long as it possibly can. Our first consideration in March was that the students had to be safe and the faculty had to be safe. So we had to move to Zoom education for that reason. We had to evacuate the dorms and we had to move to Zoom. We did it within 5 days. But we're determined, if we possibly can, to bring people back together again while making allowances for students and faculty who, for whatever reason, don't feel comfortable being there in person. So our dorm situation will permit us to bring our students back. And we will, if we can, we have the classrooms that we can practice the requisite distancing inside the classrooms and have people in class. So the question is going to be what the governor allows and what safety permits. Educationally, our optimum situation now is in-person learning with an option online for those who can't be in person. And I think we're going to have to make this decision by July 1. And it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard because the uncertainties are still that great. And you may have noticed that what some universities are doing, including Columbia, is moving effectively from a semester system to a trimester system and hoping they can scatter people over the 3 semesters, which will allow them to have fewer people on campus at any one time, and also to send people home if they need to in the middle. So this is a search for flexibility, and no one has the silver bullet, but that's where we are right now.
Yeah, and I'll say that's pretty much where we are too when it comes to the high holidays. I know we get a lot of questions about what's it going to be, and the answer is we don't know. I mean, we would love to be able to be together, but it's very hard to see how we can have 2,000 people together in the sanctuary for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But you know, we're talking about it all the time and working on it to see how we can best celebrate the holiday together, even if it's not in the same physical space. So it's a real challenge. I know that everybody's facing. We're all trying to navigate as best as we can. Well, let's switch gears once again to something. Here's a nice question about theology that we're going to come back to, and it comes from Harvey Shapiro, a fellow Central High School grad who sent this in, and he asks, I'm not sure where he heard this, but perhaps he heard this. I know he's in Florida right now. That you shared at a recent presentation that you intend to continue to write and teach about theology as your career continues. And Harvey is wondering, what might a 21st century theology look like at this point? How do we articulate a believable theology, in the words of Viktor Frankl? And is there a thinker, perhaps Buber or someone else, that you think is speaks most to us at this moment as we try to articulate a 21st century theology?
There are many thinkers who speak to us, and I've noticed in all humility over the years that there's no one who speaks so cogently and powerfully to me that I can say, well, I'm the disciple of that person. Heschel, overall, is the thinker who is by far the most important to me, and I try to live up to Heschel's teachings and to the inspiration he gave me when I got to meet him that one time as a student in 1971. But there's no one thinker out there who expresses what I'd like to express, and that's why, in all humility, I decided at the ripe old age of 69 that I'm going to take advantage of my sabbatical and sit and try to say what can be said. And when I said that to someone at lunch a couple of months ago, one of our trustees said to me, well, have you thought of writing a novel? I said, are you kidding? I mean, you got to be really good to write a novel. And he said, well, that would give you a lot more freedom. And I've been thinking about it ever since, and I might just try that, because the advantage of writing a novel, sort of like Milton Steinberg did with Acid-Driven Leaf, is I can put things in the mouths of characters that are not me, and thereby allow a lot more to be expressed. So I want to say everything I think can be said authentically on this subject, not be silent, but not say a word more than I think can be said authentically. So since you mentioned Buber, one of the things I learned from Buber, I think I learned it from Buber at a very early age, and it stuck with me ever since, that there's a difference between talking about God and talking to God. Or we might say there's a difference between knowing God cognitively, which for Judaism is virtually impossible, and knowing God experientially, or encountering God, which for Judaism is not only possible, but urged upon us. And we have the testimonies of people like Buber and Heschel and Rosenzweig and many other men and women throughout the ages that they've done that. And I take that testimony seriously. And I want to give my own kind of personal testimony about what I've experienced. Buber, and then after him, other people have this lovely notion of immediacy after reflection. They got this from the theologian and philosopher Paul Ricoeur. But this notion that things happen to you, and what are you going to do with them? How are you going to hang on to them and not dissipate them, not let them go, not explain them away? So when I teach this, and I'll just use this one example, and you may have even have heard me say this at TBS or in class at JTS. When I got to see my daughter born, like I was in the delivery room, that was the most profound religious experience of my life. And I've said before and written about this, uncontrollably, unthinkingly, what I did afterwards, when they had cleaned her off and given her to me to hold, I danced around the room, singing Baby, Baby, I Hear a Symphony over and over again from the Supremes, and saying dozens of times without being able to stop myself, thank God, thank God, thank God, thank God, thank God, thank God, thank God. Now, I can do a move on that and say, well, you were excited. It was a very emotional moment, da-da-da. And I know what biology says. I know what the science would say happened there, more or less. And I had taken the Lamaze course, as a good husband in that period would. And so I knew all the steps toward birth. But I'm holding on to that religious moment after reflection and saying, you cannot persuade me. You will not persuade me that my wife and I did that ourselves. You just won't. There was a miracle there, and I'm going to hold on to that. And people may think I'm foolish for that, but I'm going to hold on to that, and that's going to be a basic part of where I'm going to start. And I notice when I read Jewish theology, if you think back to the various texts that you know, I'm reading the Book of Kings right now, as a matter of fact, for this theology project. Jews don't do theology by going off to the wilderness to meditate in peace and quiet. They don't sit under a tree for 5 years and think pure thoughts. Jews do theology in the midst of crisis, in the midst of the exodus from Egypt, in the midst of wandering through the desert and having this incredible experience at Sinai, after Holocaust, after Churban, after revolution, after the birth of the state of Israel. That's when Jews do theology. And so when people say, well, you got excited, of course you were excited. Jews do theology when we're excited. This is the way we do it. We do it in the moment. We don't step back and wait for enlightenment to hit us in peaceableness. And so I'm trying to capture that in the kind of theology that I do. And in my life, you know, a great portion of my adulthood has been spent in the state of Israel. And I've experienced the miracle up close. And I spent my formative years as a graduate student from 1975 to 1978 in a country recovering from trauma, in a country which had almost been overrun in the 1973 war. And the study of Jewish thought of the modern period, which I did for my PhD, was done with Israelis, all of whom had either been in that war or lost people close to them in that war. And out of that, they thought about the meaning of Judaism. And that was a profound lesson to me, that we don't do it in peace and quiet. We do it, in crisis. And this is a time when we really need it. So I would do it. My late colleague Neil Gilman did. He would, and he probably did this at TBS. I don't know if Neil came, but I would bet the TBS had the gift of Neil Gilman. He would say, everyone, do your theology. Write down your theology. Don't pretend that you have to be a theologian. Whatever it is, it's going to be fragments. Write down what you think you know. Write down what you think you believe. Share it with your loved ones. Share it with your kids. And I have been witness to discussions. I have had the great fortune of facilitating discussions where people share these kinds of things with one another, and they've never shared them before. And I've been witness to parents sharing them with their children. And I've witnessed the kids saying, Mom, I didn't know you believed that. It's a remarkable moment, and we shouldn't lose it. So take the occasion of me trying to write theology. Let's all try to do something like this.
I feel Professor Gilman smiling at.
Sure. For sure.
Yeah, I still hear his words in my head about that and working on that personal theology. And I've gone back to the one that I wrote in his class when I was in rabbinical school. And it's amazing some of the things that remain, but also how much has changed during that time too, that interaction.
And that's another thing that Jewish theology always understood. That's why it can't be once and for all. And this is the lesson that Rosenzweig, by the way, the philosopher Franz Rosenzweig, beautifully taught. That why should theology remain the same? Nothing else remains the same. We don't remain the same. Being married is different than not being married. Being married after 35 years is different than being married after 2 years. So why would your opinion about something as important as God not change? And people have told me that parenthood changed them. It certainly changed me, changed everything about my belief system. So the experience of parenthood, and it's changing me all the time. And now I expect that this virus and this racial justice theme that we're all sounding right now, these are both going to change us.
Yeah. I think we're just about out of time. My apologies for those who we didn't get to their questions, but I want to say a big toda rabba, a big thank you to Chancellor Eisen for being with us tonight virtually. It's wonderful to have you. You're always great to be in conversation with you, to hear what you're thinking, and we would like to book you now for your visit after you publish your book on theology to come and well, book club. We'll read it. We'll discuss it. The whole thing.
We have 2 reasons not to set a date, not one, but 2 reasons not to set a date.
That's good. Well, we do very much would like the visits to continue to TBS, and we also would like to know that for UNAs, you are honorary members of TBS, which means not only you receive a pledge envelope on the high holidays, but also you're welcome anytime that you'd like to come here. We always
very much
love seeing.
I miss you all. You're precious to me.
Thank you. I know we all here miss you very much too, and we really appreciate you having here tonight. And I want to thank everyone for being with us tonight with this conversation. Not for one quick shameless plug, only because you mentioned it. At our Lunch and Learn tomorrow, we're starting our class on Heschel. We are going to look at that essay on religion and race tomorrow. So if you'd like to learn more about it, Chancellor Eisen mentioned it tonight. We'll be taking a look at pieces of that tomorrow at 12:30. You're welcome to join for that and for that series. Also, I just should point out, over here on Wednesday night, our community is partnering the JCRC with the ADL for a program on anti-Semitism, racism, and bigotry at 7:30, also over Zoom. An important program to be a part of as our larger community at TBS continue to explore this issue of racial justice and try to do our part in it as well to try to fight for that justice too. So I want to say Laila Tov, Toda Rabah, thank you everybody. Good to see you all tonight virtually, and hope you have a good evening. Toda Rabah. Thank you.